Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to Think About It Thursdays. It's our final Thursday of the month, and I would like to take a moment to invite everyone to this special edition of Think About It Thursdays, where we will stop our lives for a moment and think about and um, reflect on the experiences of those who survived and didn't survive the Holocaust. We remember that we must take a moment to stop and remember to never forget. And that is why we are taking this time today to interview two very special people who truly know the meaning of living in the shadow of survivors and celebrating life. um, it is very, very important, especially on a day like today. So we will take questions at the end. I'm going to go ahead. I see you guys are all slowly coming on. Welcome. Give us a little chat if you're here. You can go ahead and share the link on Facebook or on YouTube. And if you're having any trouble hearing us or anything like that, please let us know. But without further ado, I am going to introduce Galit Prince and Jordanna Gessler, who are our special guests today. So, first of all, thank you to Galit and Jordanna for saying yes. I never take it for granted that with people's crazy lives, that you will say yes. So, I'm going to move you around because I don't matter. Let's see. There we go. All right. Now you guys are up on top. So welcome. So good to have you here. We're just going to jump right in and have you each introduce yourselves. So, throughout the evening, everyone is going to hear a little bit about those who came before Galit and Jordanna, their journey to the positions that they are now. Jordanna is the vice president of education and exhibits at the Holocaust Museum, LA, and Galit Prince will soon be my mishpucha. I'd be remiss to say, but she is on the board of the museum and a 3G board member. This is the Holocaust Museum LA. So, welcome to both of you. And Jordanna, why don't we start with you? Introduce yourself and tell me what has you sitting in this position today.
Thank you so much, Cantor Lizzie, for inviting me here and to share my story. And as you said, I work at Holocaust Museum LA, and I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. It's such an honor to be speaking to the Temple Emmanuel community, especially on such an important day for commemoration and understanding. So it's really an honor to take a moment and think about my grandparents who are the inspiration for why I do the work that I do. So I'm originally from New York. My grandparents, my paternal grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My grandfather born in Bielsko, Poland, and my grandmother was born in Metz, France, to Polish Jews who had moved to France in the interwar period. And I think for me, being the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors was really an important piece of my Judaism and my upbringing, and obviously inspired me to go into a career in which I felt that it was important to engage students of all backgrounds in intergenerational dialogue with Holocaust survivors. And for me, also personally, like my grandparents didn't really share their experiences, it came out sort of in bursts. And in my work, being able to engage people in understanding Holocaust history and the important lessons, I think that was what was instilled into me by my grandparents, just like the way that they treated other people and their work ethic and the way that they felt that family and community were really important. Those are the things that I find is most inspiring when I think about their experiences.
So you did send us in two photos. So maybe we're going to get very deep into their journeys, but so why don't you tell everyone who this is?
Yeah, of course. So the little girl in the bow and the scowl is my grandmother, my Safta. This was in France. She was born in Alsace-Lorraine, which is the area between France and Germany. And so she actually grew up speaking French and German, which was really important for her experience during the Holocaust, had an actual significant impact. But this is the oldest photo we have of her. We're very fortunate to have a photo of her from before the war. And then the other photograph is of my grandfather in 1946. And it's actually, so Alec, this is the oldest photograph we have of his. We have no pre-war photographs of him, just simply because photographs don't really tend to have like monetary value. And so either were not things that people took with them when they were fleeing their homes, but also were also not things that like people saved. Like anyone who took over a home or took over possessions would most likely destroy photographs. And so to have even a photograph of someone from before the war is a really precious thing.
Okay, wow. So, first of all, thank you for sending that in. I'm going to now bring on Galit. I'll let Jordanna take a breather for a moment. Sorry, I'm being technological director on top of everything. Here is Galit. Galit, who are you? And I will also share photos as you request.
Hi, everyone. I'm Galit Prince. I'm mishpacha with Lizzie very, very soon. And I'm just so honored that you asked me to be here to talk about my grandmother. Any opportunity to talk about my grandmother and her history and her survival story is so meaningful for me. My grandmother was really young. She was 6 years old when the war began. And unlike Jordanna, I have what seems like hundreds of photos. And that's because my grandmother's father was a photographer, and they had family in Palestine, and they would send a ton of photos to my grandmother's aunt in Palestine. And so I have so many photos of my grandmother pre-war, and also, of course, after the war. I just shared a couple. I just have one for Lizzie right now that is just a photo of my grandmother with her family. She is on the lower right in the white. Her sister is right next to her, who's 2 years older than her. Her brother, who did not survive the war, and then her parents. Her mom did not survive the war either. So my grandmother survived, her sister survived, and her father survived. And she was really, she was 6 years old, and she recounts it all. My whole life, my grandmother spoke about the war. I always knew that she was a Holocaust survivor. It was never a secret. I don't know if I always understood what the Holocaust was at such a young age, but she spoke about it, and she spoke about survival. And really her message, I just watched a video of her today, and she was so vibrant and very charismatic. And her whole philosophy was to love, love, and give more love. She never, ever used the word hate. And I just think it's so beautiful that her message was we all have to love each other and be kind to one another and just be a good human. And that's really the message that I think about today from my grandmother. And she was like that in the community with her family. She made a decision to be happy and live a very fruitful and abundant life.
Amazing. And I will say that I am a witness to the joy that she has had all of you live, because you're one of the most joyful families. So I am very
Thank you.
happy for her survival and your survival. Okay, so part of what really brought this conversation on for me is the fact that I am not the granddaughter of a survivor. That the Holocaust as a whole was only in my ether, in the same way that a lot of Jewish kids, they go to Hebrew school, and especially back in the late 80s and 90s, you were in fourth grade. Jordan and we talked about this, about you had to read Anne Frank, or I actually think at a much younger age than kids today, you were showed the pictures of starving people and graves full of bodies. That is my earliest recollection of the Holocaust. All of my grandparents on both sides had immigrated from, and great grandparents, in fact. My grandparents mostly, they were all born in the United States, believe it or not. My great grandparents had immigrated here in the the beginning of the century. So perhaps you could say that I am blessed. They are survivors in their own way because things were getting bad for Jews all over Eastern Europe, even in the late, the turn of the century. So what really I wanted to get this sense of was, what was the difference for the two of you compared to me growing up? As I said, I've shared now what my moment of what the Holocaust was, which really was during Hebrew school and then during high school, when I was sort of just forced to watch documentaries and look at pictures. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask both of you is, when was the moment where some of the discussions perhaps that happened in your household um, matched up with, oh, that's the Holocaust. That's what my grandparents went through. So a moment of an epiphany, perhaps, if you have one. I'd love to hear from you. So who wants to go first?
I guess for me, it just was always there. Like, I don't think I ever learned what the Holocaust was. I think I just always knew what it was. And really, when you ask about like a moment where you're thinking about it, in my family, we spent Pesach with my dad's side of the family, which is the Holocaust side of the family. And just having people around the table, like some people with Auschwitz numbers, other people not, but everyone of that age group being a survivor and talking about the loss and the people who should have been sitting at the Seder table who weren't. That to me, as long as I can remember, was this experience of being a child and hearing stories of people who were not there. And whether it was explained to me in the way of what happened, it wasn't. It was more of just this terrible loss that existed and understanding, that we were telling sad stories about something bad that happened. And it really wasn't until I think I was in grade school and learning about it more in a historical setting where I was like, oh, like that is the thing that I've been hearing about or knowing about for forever. But I don't think there was ever a point in my life that I did not know what the Holocaust was.
Is it fair to say that you had this more of a sense of missing people than actual images of what the Holocaust looked like?
Yeah, I would say that. Like there wasn't like photos of like what it was. It was more like the loss. So, like, Galit shared that like her grandmother's mother perished in the Holocaust. My grandfather's mother perished in the Holocaust as well. And so sort of like him just saying things like, oh, my mother made like the best gefilte fish. And sort of thinking like, well, Saba, like, where is your mom? Oh, she died. Um, Sort of little stories like that in my understanding of like this terrible violent thing that happened, but not really grappling with the extent or the how expansive it was.
And you reminded me, you grew up in New York, right?
I did, yes.
And can you share a little bit about, were you unique in your position of having grandparents who were Holocaust survivors?
So no, I grew up in New York, going to Jewish day school. So a good number of kids in my class, in my grade, all had grandparents who were in the Holocaust, and so it was not unique. So that's another aspect of it. I think it really strangely wasn't until I was in college that I learned that people did not know Holocaust survivors, or people like did not know about the Holocaust, or did not really understand what had happened, because I lived in this community where there were so many survivors. Like, I mean, it's really a blessing and an honor to hear their stories and to have this vivacious, like vivid community. Some who shared, some who didn't, but who were all there, and we all had this shared experience of being part of that kind of family.
Yeah, that's amazing to think about. Galit, we grew up in the same city, and I've talked about how I had one best friend who was a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I'm sure in Beverly Hills I had more, but that was the only one that was very present for me. So maybe talk a little bit about your life in Los Angeles as the daughter of yeah. Go ahead.
Sure. Sort of the opposite of Jordanna and more like you, I didn't know anyone that was a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. That was really unique. I was sort of alone in that and sort of just connected with my cousins who had that similarity because I didn't have friends. And today I really don't have friends until I joined the board of the museum and the third generation group. I hadn't had a community of people that also had grandparents of Holocaust survivors. And so, and also I have a mom that's Israeli. So that was also sort of unique and different. But my mom told me that growing up in Israel, all of the kids had parents that were grandparents that were Holocaust survivors. So it was, it was like, of course, your grandmother's, oh, your parents a Holocaust survivor. So she grew up amongst survivors, right? Second generation and survivors. And here for me, I didn't have that. I was, I just, I didn't know anyone growing up who had a grandparent that was a Holocaust survivor.
Do you remember having to explain to any friends that what the Holocaust was at a young age? You might not, but do you remember having to bring that out as a part of your identity to your peers?
I think sort of like what Jordanna was saying, I also fall like number 4 from my eldest cousins. And so we spoke about the Holocaust a lot. And a lot of the times my grandmother would say to me, you don't understand what I went through. You don't understand the things that I had gone through. She's like, you're just so, you're young, you're too young. And I was telling you both yesterday, like I haven't seen till this day Schindler's List. And it came out when I was 9 years old. And my grandmother was like, you're too young to see that. But that's what I went through. And so I think there's just in passing, when I learned about it, I was like, oh my God, when I learned about Anne Frank and sort of when I read Anne Frank, I think that's when things started to connect, that my grandmother survived that war. But I always just knew about it. I always just knew. And she has pictures all over her house till this day. And so I knew about people that were her family pre-war, after war. And so I don't really have an epiphany or a moment where I really discovered or connected the dots, because it was just sort of like ever present throughout my whole childhood.
I'm going to show a picture of you and your grandmother, just so sweet.
So yeah, that's sort of the way I remember her. I mean, she, as I mentioned earlier, super vibrant, and she chose to live a very grand, rich life. You can tell even by her jewels. Her jewels saved her. So that's what saved her from the war. And so she always believed that was currency, and God forbid something else would happen again. She had jewelry as a way out.
How did her jewels save her? Explain that to us a little more.
Yeah, so they'd pay off the Nazis with jewelry. And that kept her alive and her sister alive, and her dad, really, for that matter. But any moment at any time, and for a long time, the whole family was sort of safe in the ghetto, and they would pay off Nazis with jewelry. She came from an affluent family, and they had pearls and they had diamonds and little things here and there. But it was just like, here, I'm going to give you some of this, like, take care of my family, don't shoot them, sort of just like leave them alone, just don't touch them. And she got papers. But the way she was able to survive was really through her dad paying off people with jewelry, whatever they could find, but really jewelry. So her whole life after the war, she really had amazing, gorgeous jewelry. But I think for her it was, savior in a way.
So can you, I'll start with Jordanna, and then I would love to paint a little bit of a picture. You've given a grand background, but a little bit of a timeline, pre-war to the beginning, through they're just, like a timeline of their experience would be, to whatever degree if you can share that with everyone.
Yeah, so my grandfather was born in Bielsko-Biała, Poland, which is southwest of Krakow. It had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, so the family spoke German, like they considered themselves like Austrian to some extent. And in 1939, when the Nazis marched into Poland, my grandfather and his family were some of the 250,000 Polish Jewish refugees who immediately just picked up and went to live under the Soviets. So the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany both invaded Poland, and some Polish Jews sort of recognized that to live under the Soviets was probably better than to live under the Nazis. And so they left with nothing, ended up in Lvov, which is now Lviv, Ukraine, and lived there until 1941 when the Nazis then invaded the Soviet Union. And only recently I learned that my grandfather, and this is after my grandfather passed, and it was through archival research, that my grandfather was in the ghetto there and was in the Yanovska concentration camp, which was also there. And so I say this because like he never really gave us like a timeline of experience, and a lot of what he was not someone who talked about his time in the Holocaust. It would come out in like very emotional, like sort of fits and bursts and moments when he would cry or sort of like say one story or one thing that he witnessed. That was quite horrific. And then, since then I've like sort of pieced it together, but he was able to escape from there. And his younger brother and sister were in the care of a Catholic woman who saved their lives because they were very, very young and like didn't know their Jewish identity. So it was easy for them to be hidden. And he was liberated in 1945, and he already knew his mother was dead and did not want to return to his hometown, and actually then made his way to the British Mandate of Palestine, which I know we can get to. But so that's like a very like sort of high picture experience for him. I know that like from things that he shared in these like outbursts that he and I think all Holocaust survivors, we think like we can think of sort of their experiences in like a very historical timeline, but really just like the extreme trauma and violence that they witnessed every single day of their experience, whether, I heard my grandfather talk about it and other survivors as well, of seeing like children killed in front of them. Or, my grandfather once shared at one point he was living under false documents and in this like town in Poland. And one day the entire town is like called to this town center, and the Nazis had found a Catholic family hiding a Jewish family, and they lined up both families and just shot every single person. And he had to stand there knowing that like he was in hiding, and so he couldn't even show his reaction in the way that like he would naturally show it, of fear. And these are the little pieces, and I think like whether or not we have the whole picture or the entire timeline, understanding that like every single day of like extreme brutality and extreme anxiety was something they were living with, and that anyone who went through this and was able to forge a life for themselves is truly like the epitome of resiliency. And that's what I think we see whenever we like hear from survivors or like Galit or myself like witness from our own grandparents.
Absolutely. And do you want to say anything about your grandmother? This is your grandmother,
Yeah,
right?
so that's my grandmother, Gas. So yeah. Safta, my Safta. I know Galit's Safta is also her Safta. Yes. So Safta was born in France, and like I said, her first languages were German and French, and so her father was actually like one of the few who was like, something bad is happening in Germany. Like the anti-Semitism that we are witnessing reminds me of the pogroms of Eastern Europe, which is what Lizzie probably drove your family to the U.S. And he was talking about like wanting to leave, and everyone thought he was crazy in his family. Like, why? Like we live in like a Western country, like we're fine. And one day he was a tailor, he owned a store. He went down to a store, and a bunch of like Nazi supporters, because they were in this like Alsace-Lorraine, this area where there were a lot of Germans and a lot of French people, came and brutally like abused him and broke everything in the store, and they were yelling like dirty Jew. And he came home like tattered and bruised and said like, we actually need to get out of here. So he was able to arrange for my grandmother and her brother, who were the two little kids, with false papers to go to Germany as non-Jews. And so my grandmother remembers like being on the train and the Nazis like coming on the train to check everyone's papers. And because she spoke German and had like blonde hair and blue eyes, and which was like what the Nazis thought like Jews didn't have, they were like bouncing her on like their lap and like giving her candy, and she's just like chatting away. And they were able, under false pretenses, to get paperwork that then took them to the British Mandate of Palestine. Their parents, my great grandfather, and I only learned this really, really recently. There was this family in Belgium who, so long story short, it was incredibly hard to get papers to go to the British Mandate of Palestine at this time, and for so many different reasons. But one of the ways that you could do it is if you showed the British government you had a lot of money. And so there was this Jewish family in Belgium that would put their money in your bank account, that you would show that you could travel. And then once you got there, you would transfer the money back. So that is how my grandmother's parents were able to
Wow.
escape. And my grandmother says that she remembers, like, the day before she boarded that train, she was with her cousins who are her age, and she remembers her dad saying to his brother, like, "You need to leave." And he was like, "No, like, this is not going to happen here. You're nuts. Like, why would you go to, like, an arid desert with, like, nothing?" And every single person in their entire family was murdered in the Holocaust.
Wow. Mm. Yeah. Well, may their memory be for a blessing. That's all. There's no response. So, and okay, I just wanted to take a moment. Galit, will you share your grandmother's story up until the liberation? Because we're going to talk a little bit about the interim period. But go ahead.
Jordanna, I didn't even know that story about your grandmother, so
Yeah.
very interesting to hear that. Also, because she was in France and not in Poland like my grandmother. So my grandmother was born in 1932 in Radomsko, Poland. In 1939, she sort of remembers just a complete shift. And, her recollections are of a child. So it's a bit, I think, different and sort of piecemealing what she can remember and what her sister or her father told her. But she remembers being rounded up, and they were in the Radomsko ghetto for 2 years. Her entire family was there. Her brother got murdered in the ghetto, going to get coal for heat. There was a curfew, and he was past the curfew coming back home. And on his way home, they murdered him. A couple weeks before they sort of liquidated the ghetto, a Nazi had mentioned it to my Savta's father. As I mentioned earlier, he was paying off the Nazis with jewelry, and he was able to get false paperwork saying that they were not Jewish and they were Catholic. My grandmother was then sent to a woman who taught her Catholicism. She knew that she was Jewish. She taught her Catholicism and to believe in Jesus and Mary. And my grandmother said, from that moment on, I knew I was no longer Jewish. I had a new name, I had a new identity, and that was my story. And throughout, and she's like, I always remember, I've asked her this, she was like, I always knew I was Jewish, but for the time of the war, I did not have that identity anymore, and she just dropped it. My grandmother has fair skin, blue eyes, had fair color hair, and could also pass exactly, and could also pass. And that's my grandfather, who also, I guess, is a Holocaust survivor, but sort of lived in the forest, basically just running away from Russia and just hiding and hiding and hiding. Was never educated, and he eventually, years later, just made it to Israel. But he survived by hiding in the forest. My grandmother had a little bit more of like the Holocaust route. So she learned Catholicism. She was sent to a convent. Shortly thereafter, they saw that it was time for her to kneel, I guess, at some point, and she was like the last one to kneel. And they saw that she was like a little bit delayed on some things. And the nuns were like, we don't want to deal with this. And this doesn't seem right. So she went back to the woman that sort of taught her Catholicism and waited for her father to get her paperwork to send her to an Austrian labor camp, where she basically stayed there throughout the entire war, working at a woman's farm and survived just hiding.
As a Jewish person or as it was her?
No, she wasn't Jewish till after the war. So as a Catholic girl with no parents, like her, parents weren't around, as a Catholic girl working at a labor camp, working on the farm, working on the fields, helping around the house, sort of just like labor. There was a moment she told me that before she made it to the Austrian labor camp, she got interrogated. And she was living in the neighborhood with this woman while she was in between the convent and going to the Austrian labor camp. And these like, who is this girl? She's a new girl in the neighborhood. We don't recognize her. So the mother told this woman, went to her boyfriend who was an SS soldier and said, there's a girl in this neighborhood. She's new. I don't know her deal. They took my grandmother into a torture chamber. She said that she remembers walking in, blood everywhere. And she said, like, this was it. Like, I knew that this was the end of me. And they started interrogating her. And she said, all I could say was that I am Regina. I am Catholic girl. I don't know anything about Judaism. And she got on her hands and knees and started praying to Jesus and Mary. And she says that Mary saved her. And every moment she could, she would pray to Jesus and Mary. She herself believed it. I mean, she was just like, I'm a Catholic girl. So she got liberated in 1945. The Russians liberated her, or, you know, them. And she eventually, which we'll get to, went to like 3 different countries, you know, for 3 years. And then eventually in 1948, went to Palestine or Israel. But yeah, it's just sort of a crazy story. She was really young, you know, 7 years old.
I don't think we're gonna have time tonight, but I really want to hear her. Well, hopefully we'll have time. I want to hear how she came back to Judaism, story, how she made that transition. But I had a moment of epiphany yesterday, which seems like it should be really obvious, but sometimes that you just don't think about things, which is I had this big vision of people basically being liberated from the camps and taken directly to Israel. And that's not what happened. You know, I think that was like me trying to grasp onto this like vision of Israel as the place where so many survivors found refuge. But maybe Jordanna, I do want to remind everyone, and guys, I am getting your comments. I'll have to look at them in a sec. I want to just remind everyone. Hold on. That Jordanna here. Oh nope, that's not even the right one. Here's Jordanna. That not only is Jordanna the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, but also the vice president of education and exhibits at the Holocaust Museum LA. So Jordanna, and Galit knows a ton too. But Jordanna, will you give us a little bit of the picture of what I'm calling this interim period between the end of the Holocaust and the creation of Israel? And that was a 3-year period. And what happened to all of the survivors? You can, and also Galit and Jordanna, you can go into your stories too, but what happened?
So, I mean, as some of you probably know, as most of you probably know, during the 1930s, as the Nazis are coming to power and making life incredibly difficult and horrific for any Jewish person living under them, there is this desperate refugee crisis where Jewish people are trying to get out, trying to find a place to go, and there's no place that will accept them. The United States had a really strict quota system against Jewish people from Europe. And not only did they have a quota system, but they weren't even filling the quotas, not because there weren't people who wanted to come, but really because there was anti-Semitism and bias within the State Department of the US. And those same quota systems exist in 1945. So 1945, people are liberated and are either told, like, go home, you're free. And for many of them, they're, what is home? They've seen their entire families murdered in front of their eyes. They know what's happened to their communities. Really, what does home mean? So if they're trying, so these displaced persons camps are set up by the Allied armies, particularly by the US, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, and Czechoslovakia. And people are there, like learning English, going to school, taking classes, searching for their family members, really like trying to figure out what they're going to do with their lives. Are they going to remain in Europe or are they going to immigrate? And if they're going to immigrate, where are they immigrating to? Because again, the US still has this quota system. And if they want to go to the British mandated Palestine, the British have an equally harsh law against allowing Jewish immigrants into what becomes Israel. So for those who try to enter the British mandated Palestine at this time, if they are caught by the British, they are actually put into detention camps. So they go from being behind barbed wire in Nazi Europe to being behind barbed wire on Cyprus and in other detention camps set up by the British. there is a very infamous boat called the Exodus, which was a ship carrying survivors, which was bombed by the British. And then the survivors from the Exodus were put on another boat and sent straight back to Europe. And there's this moment where the survivors are on the boat, and the boat is outside of mainland Europe, and they're like, we are not getting off this ship. We refuse to go. And they take the Union Jack and paint a swastika on top of it and fly it. And this was printed in Life magazine in the United States.
Do you have that picture? I just realized you were maybe going to share that.
I can pull up that picture super quick. Actually, I can probably find it. But, here is this moment, exactly how Lizzie was saying, how we think that like people were freed and then could go to the places that they wanted to go. But in reality, it was they had nowhere to go. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe. I've heard stories of survivors returning to their homes in Poland and in other places in Eastern Europe and literally being killed. And so there was a lot of fear and confusion and desperation on the part of the survivors. And I will share, though, that in addition to these horrific events that I'm talking about, so here's the photo. Can you see it, Lizzie? Yes, okay. So this is the photograph I'm talking about, where you have these Holocaust survivors who have not only survived the Holocaust, but have now survived the British attack on the ship that they're on, trying to get to Eretz Yisrael, and the ship has been sent back. They've been sent back to Europe, and they're refusing to get off the ship, and they paint a swastika on top of the Union Jack. So, this is a time of desperation, but also the DP camps had the highest birth rate in a post-war Europe. So this is also a moment where we see people finding meaning in life. Like, what does it mean to get married? What does it mean to have a child? Like, what is that hope for the future? So despite the desperation, people are hoping for the future. So my own grandparents, as I mentioned, my grandmother illegally entered the British Mandate during the war under non-Jewish papers. And my grandfather was liberated by the Soviet army in 1945 and sort of just, felt in himself that he did not want to return home. He knew his mother was dead. Like, he just knew his community was devastated. And he was able also to get to Israel in 1946 and through walking through Syria and truly just like surviving, continuing. But it was a really difficult time for people, these years between 1945 and 1948. So 1948, the state of Israel is declared, and all survivors and all refugees are welcomed, but also the United States, that's the year that they get rid of their quota system. So, or they don't get rid of their quota system, they allow the Jewish survivors to enter. So between 45 and 48, there is extreme chaos and uncertainty about future.
Galit, do you want to share a little bit about your grandmother specifically? Maybe your grandfather too. I don't know where he was after hiding in the forest, how he ended up in Israel.
I don't think he knows where he was either. So I think he just had to survive. I don't think he knew where he was. But it's interesting because there is a gap, right? Like, we hear about the war, and then I'm like, and she's in Israel. But I'm like, how did you get to Israel and what happened in between, right? From 13 years old, and my grandmother went to Israel in 48. She was 16 years old and went straight into the army. So I actually have like a little paper here from an interview that she wrote. And she said, after the war, her sister went to Vienna to go get her from the Austrian labor camp. They went back to Poland. They went back into their home. Their father was there. They stayed there for a couple months. And then their neighbors, they kicked him out. They came up with guns and they said, get out of your house. And if you don't leave, we're going to kill you. It's sort of what just Jordanna alluded to. People were just forced out of their homes with everything in it, just as it was. And she never went back. And that was that. From there, she went to Czechoslovakia. From Czechoslovakia, she went to Germany, and she went to Berlin, and then Bergen-Belsen. And her father put them in an orphanage and said, I got to go figure out my life. I got to figure out some stuff for us and set us up. And they were in an orphanage for 2 years, just alone. I think, with her sister, and it was just the two of them by themselves, like as if they had no parents. Her father came back, was a head of the DP camp. He brought them back with him 2 years later. They lived in the DP camp. And from 45, well, I guess she said, I don't know, I'm a little wrong with my numbers, but at 47, she was at the DP camp with her father. And at 48, she's like, I'm going to Israel. And she made a decision that she was going to go serve in the army and change her passport and change her papers to say that she was 18 years old. So she had been in the army at 48, at 16 years old, and at 18, she met my grandfather in the army, and she was already an officer and stayed there for another couple years until she married my grandfather at 20 and had a kid at 20. You know, at 19, married him, and at 20 had a child. But she just was like, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to fight. And she made it to Israel. But she did say that during that time, she said when the Russians came to liberate, you know, it was a free for all. You know, many women and girls were getting raped. They were not treating the Holocaust survivors well. They took advantage of them in sort of every way. And she said it was just, you know, chaos for years.
It's just unimaginable to think that after, I just have to say, I didn't know this. Like, it's amazing to think that after everything that she had been through, even though her story is very interesting, but that she went and served in the army. I mean, she just, what a fighter. I mean, that is just so magnificent.
I think both of our grandparents met in the army.
You met each other?
Oh,
No. I mean, like,
no.
Galit's grandparents. Did your grandparents meet in the army?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and my grandparents met in the army. Like, just to think about,
Really?
like, our grandmothers, like, in the army.
It's crazy.
It's amazing.
And what's also sort of unique for both of us is both of our grandparents made it to Israel. Not everyone's grandparents went to Israel, right? Like some went to Canada, some went to China, some went to, you know, South America. You know, everyone went everywhere. It just so happens that both Jordanna and our grandparents ended up in Israel.
So now let's fast forward. We're going to go back, but fast forward to Jordanna, how you ended up working for the museum, the Holocaust Museum LA, sorry, and how Galit, how you ended up joining or being asked to be on the 3G board. And then the second part of that question would be, what are things that you've learned from your peers who are also in this 3G group that maybe you didn't know before you had joined this group? Maybe the importance of the 3G board.
Yeah, of course. So clearly my grandparents were Holocaust survivors and it was part of my experience growing up. But like that being said, I don't see my brother here working at the same museum that I'm working at. I think I always had a real passion for history and just sort of thinking about how history informs our intentions and our actions today. So I went to graduate school for Holocaust studies and I lived in Israel and really felt a connection to specifically like museum education because I find that museum education is oftentimes educating people who might not know a lot about the topic that you're going to. Most people, when you visit a museum, you want to learn. And that was something I was really drawn to is educating people who might not know a lot or are just interested and curious. And I moved to LA about 8 years ago. I didn't know anyone here, and I actually quickly met Galit, and I also had the privilege and honor of knowing her grandmother, Esther. And I would say, you know, Lizzie, when you asked this question about like what have we learned from each other, you know, Esther and Galit's grandmother was just like such a force of nature. I would be working at the museum and somebody would come into the museum and be like, excuse me, I met this woman, Esther, like in a restaurant last night. And she told me this most amazing story. And she told me I had to come to the Holocaust Museum. And I don't know anything about the Holocaust, but she was incredible. So I have to be here. And really coming from a place where like in my family, the Holocaust was something that wasn't like so openly shared. It felt so like liberating or inspiring to hear of this person and a woman no less who had experienced this and was basically saying like, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to tell every single person I meet and I'm going to share that. And I don't want to speak for like Galit and her family, but like from the outside, what I've learned from it is just like this unapologetic like characteristic of like who you are, and not apologizing and not being ashamed if you've been a victim, or if you've been a survivor, if you've witnessed horrific things, or if you've experienced horrific things, to really just like stand up and be proud and be like, I experienced this, and like I'm not going to be quiet. So that's something that I definitely learned from Galit and her grandmother. And I would say that, like, from knowing Galit for a number of years, I've learned from her that she's the same way, that she's like unapologetically herself. And so that is what I would say that I learned from Galit. But really, I think that keeping, like my grandfather never talked about his story, and more people have learned from him through me because of my work. And so really, I think that is what inspired me.
Thank you. Wow. That's why we have you here today. It's amazing. Galit?
Jay, thank you for saying that about my grandmother. It's always nice when someone knows someone, before they pass and has a relationship with them. It's so meaningful to me, and she loved you so much. So my grandmother found, I think it felt like a home when she first learned about the museum. She was an early supporter when the building was built in 2010, the museum. And she was always just very passionate. And I just always knew that this museum existed. And I wasn't really actually involved, but my grandmother found a home, really a home, and an extended family, but being there. And like a good Jewish daughter, I listened to my Jewish mom, who said, you have to get involved in the museum. And I did. That was that. I just knew that while my grandmother was alive, I was going to put on events and have her speak to as many people as she can. And that's really what I did. That was sort of my mission. And I sort of just threw her on every stage with any microphone I could, because she was willing to talk and she had a really strong message. And it was just really inspiring to see her. She was a woman of hope and of love. And she wasn't sort of like depressing to listen to. It was just like so inspirational. And I knew when she passed in 2017, it was a really big shift for me, because I was one of the lucky few granddaughters like Jordanna that have or had their grandparents alive for quite later in life. And it was sort of my mission to get her out and get her story out as long as she was alive and I was doing this work. And when she passed, I think there was like a big shift for me. And I realized, oh no, I'm sharing her story. It's now my responsibility. And I felt a really deep connection with the museum and the third generation group, who I realized suffered similar to random traumas that I have, that I didn't really knew. I thought it was only me or only my family or only like my cousins and I went through it. Later did I realize like we would all have very similar stories of trauma, funny, weird things, but like that was just being a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. And I think we all really could relate to that. And it felt sort of like a community that I didn't personally grew up with. And yeah, I don't know. It was just, I felt, and I still do feel just like the museum is a second home for me and for my family, really.
It's amazing. I mean, truly amazing. We can't take for granted, as you said, that survivors all wanted to be in front of a microphone, because every single time that they have to speak, they are reliving a very, very painful part of their past. At another special that was on in January, there was a woman who didn't even admit to her family that she was a Holocaust survivor until I believe she was in her 40s. And there was a trip to Israel for Holocaust survivors. And she said she was going, and her family said, "What? You're not a survivor?" And she said, "Oh, yes, I am." So she realized at that point that she really had to start speaking out and telling her story. So this might be, I know we're counting down and we have about another 8 minutes, but first of all, you both have done such a beautiful job articulating the spirit of your grandparents. But if they were here right now, is there one thing that stands out as the message that they would be saying? I mean, maybe it's something they've said to their audiences of the past, but one message that they would be saying at the end, this is all that matters, or, something like that, that they want you to walk away with, or would want us to walk away
Yes.
with?
Get married to someone Jewish and have lots of kids.
Yep.
I feel like my grandmother would always just say have kids, get married, have kids. I think, and she lived a really full life. She had 4 kids. There's 12 grandchildren. There's 3 great grandchildren. I mean, she was all about let's live a big life and have a big family, and let's show them I'm alive, and I'm going to show them I'm alive. So, and not to hate, but really she was just have those kids. But for all seriousness, she was just you can never use the word hate. You cannot live in a world where there's hate. And that word was forbidden. You couldn't even be I hate that it's raining right now. She was you're not, that word is forbidden from our vocabulary. And she said, you need to use the word love, only love. You can never use the word hate, because hate is what led to this Holocaust. So that's sort of my thing.
I will definitely walk away with that. That's amazing. Yeah, Jordanna.
I would say that they were or they would say to be proud of who you are. And also my grandparents were huge animal lovers, and also just showing compassion and kindness to all living beings, I think was also a really big piece instilled in us, that no matter who you are, if you're alive on this earth, you deserve respect and care.
It's amazing lessons that we should all live with every day, that it is yet so important to remind ourselves of the simplicity of find love, have kids, don't use the word hate, use the word love, use everything that you guys have been saying. In some ways it's well, of course, but it's not, of course, right? Today we live in a world, Jordanna, maybe you want to share a little bit about the latest anti-Semitism numbers. I know you brought it up yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, really unfortunately, the ADL 2 days ago released new statistics that anti-Semitism is at an all-time high in Los Angeles, and in the country. And I think it really just reminds us that so much of what we do when it comes to Zachor and remembrance is not just commemorating, but is also action and education and conversation. And I know that at Holocaust Museum LA, what we really aim to do is bring people together and learn from one another, and get rid of this word hate, as Galit said, and as in Esther's words, and really think about how we treat people with dignity and respect, and how we are proud of who we are, but also want to hear about how other people are proud of who they are, and create spaces where we learn from one another, because unfortunately, anti-Semitism did not begin in the Holocaust, and it did not end in the Holocaust. And we really need to think about how we speak to others and share ourselves, but also create space to learn from others as well.
Beautiful. Perhaps this is part of my naivety, ignorance, you could say anything, but I'm going to say it because, as my family has always said to me since I was a kid, people learn when you ask questions. But I'm more going to say a statement, and maybe it's obvious, which is, whenever I've heard, when you think of the Holocaust, when you think of Yom HaShoah or Holocaust Remembrance Day, you hear 2 phrases: never forget, and never forget, and also in some ways always remember, right? And for so long, I put that to the negative connotation of never forget what happened to our people, right? Which I think a lot of people think. You never, during Purim, we say, blot out the name of Amalek, of our oppressors, right? Never forget what happened to us. And all of a sudden, today, after speaking with you, and last night after speaking with you both, I realized that maybe I shouldn't be leaning so much into the never forget what happened to us, but maybe I should be leaning into never forget those loved ones who didn't survive. Always remember the siblings of your grandparents who didn't survive. Always remember their stories, of course, but just the dichotomy between never forget what happened to us, and yet never forget the people who did not survive to tell their stories. I think we have to balance out the Yom HaShoah or any Holocaust Remembrance Day with these two concepts. So perhaps that's just a different way in how I have been thinking about this concept today. But I do hope that discussions like this continue. I'm going to turn it over for the last 2 minutes. Number one, thank you to Galit. Thank you to Jordanna. Thank you for sharing your stories. People are very touched by hearing firsthand accounts. But Jordanna, as think about the survivors who turned their lives around in good ways. Yes, Marge, that is definitely true. Jordanna, give us a 2-minute spiel of how we can help support the Holocaust Museum of LA.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you're interested
Where it
in
is,
hearing from
all that stuff.
if you're interested in hearing a story from a Holocaust survivor who's still here and active in the community, every single Thursday at 11 a.m. We have a virtual survivor talk. I invite you to tune in either on Facebook or on Zoom. Also visit us. We are free to California residents, which I think most of you are. And we have, primary source artifacts and survivor testimony that not only speak to this experience, but also speak to the importance of community building and learning from history and really thinking about how we can build a more dignified world. You can visit us at holocaustmuseumla.org to look at our upcoming events. We have quite a few. You can also follow us on social media or stop on in. We are in Pan Pacific Park across from the Grove. And, I think it would be really interesting for you to come and explore our primary source artifacts and hear from survivors in our community.
Fantastic. Anything to close, Galit or Jordanna?
It's such an honor to be here and to be able to talk about my grandmother's story, and for Jordanna to talk about her grandparents' story and to hear it. I think back to what you said about never forgetting those that perish. Actually, one of our board members, Stephen Greinberg, has created a website called Illuminate, where you light a candle. You can do today and tomorrow, or for this weekend, I guess. And you light a candle in remembrance of someone that passed. And basically all you get is a name. Sometimes there's a little information about the person, but it's, may their memory be a blessing, may their name be a blessing. And recognizing that there were 6 million people that died in the Holocaust. And by doing this, like I did it yesterday, it's a way to just, for whoever, for that family, for that person, acknowledge them and acknowledge their life. So for me, that was really important, not only for my grandmother and her siblings and her family and her parents, but also the 6 million that we don't even know about. Jordanna, do you want to add anything else?
Closing? No. All right. Well, thank you
Come
guys
visit
so
the
much.
museum.
Yes, please come visit the museum. Also, please join us on May 26th at 7 p.m. for this discussion about Rabbi Aaron's favorite subject, Lashon Hara. You've heard him talk about it a lot, but you've never heard me and him go at it about this concept. So join us May 26th at 7 p.m. Did you hear that he said your mom said something that your cousin heard, who told me at the supermarket while we were buying groceries, something like that. But the concept is being present and not talking about other people. So we will see you then. Bye, everyone, and thank you.